The first station. Jesus is condemned to death. When we begin the journey of the stations of the cross, we find ourselves often reflecting on our own journeys, on our own ways that we have experienced life. The stations of the cross give us an opportunity to reflect, as traditionally we would walk around the church, or for those of us who've been lucky enough to go to Jerusalem, I've had the opportunity to walk the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, ourselves. But our sense as we begin this journey is one of trepidation, of anger sometimes, and of course of deep sorrow. In the first station, Jesus is condemned to death. The stations often depict Jesus standing with people pointing at him. But in this painting by Nigel Grooms, all we see is the face of Jesus and the shape of what seems like a heart underneath. There is light and energy emanating from him. And in the darkness, and in the bloodiness of the red, a little patch of white above. Jesus here looks out at us. Who is it in the end who condemned Jesus to death? Was it his own followers? Was it the religious authorities? Was it the political establishment? In the first station, Jesus looks to us and asks us whether we will defend him, whether we will stand up for him. But also here, whether we will journey with him. We know from the biblical accounts that many of Jesus' disciples at this point ran away. But here, Jesus asks us to walk with him. The question we have is whether we will. The second station is Jesus is made to carry his cross. For those of you who've been to Jerusalem, you'll know that the way is quite steep. It goes up, constantly turning and twisting through the streets of Jerusalem, up to the hill of Golgotha. And here, Jesus begins his journey, forced to carry the instrument of torture upon which he will die. The effect here is of the sheer weight, the heftiness of the wood. Crucifixes were very large, solidly built, incredibly heavy, made of rough hewn wood. So we walk with Christ as he puts his shoulders underneath, as he walks with the splinters digging into his back, mocked and jeered by the crowds who've lined up to watch him. Do we hold back? Do we follow at a safe distance? Or are we close? Do we smell the sweat, the blood, the fear? Do we have the sense of the cross dragging on the floor behind him? This beginning of the journey is in some sense the hardest. We don't quite know what to expect as the streets twist and turn. But again, Jesus asks us to travel with him, to walk with him, and to be present. The third station. Jesus falls for the first time. This is the first of the only stations that are repeated. It reminds us of our own failures. Despite the narratives and stories that we tell ourselves, our lives are not divided up into the good things that we've done, the bad things that we'd rather no one else knew about, and our public mistakes. Neither are we ever defined by a single action. All of us have fallen multiple times. The repetition in these three stations reminds us that we are not going to fall once or twice, but over and over again, each day being an opportunity to serve, to connect more deeply to our faith, to reflect on our fears and failings, and to commit ourselves anew. The first time Jesus falls, it's a stumble. The wood of the cross crashing down on the floor, perhaps a glancing blow. But Jesus picks up the cross and carries on his journey. How many times have we, through a small stumble, wanted to give up? But Jesus knows his calling and his plan. He picks up the cross and he carries on. The fourth station. Jesus meets his mother. In many ways, this is one of the most heartbreaking stations. the moment when Mary, who was told when Jesus was born that her own soul would be pierced, who has probably been hoping upon hope that what she was told in the temple all those years ago would never come true. It now is coming true in front of her eyes. In this station, traditionally and in these ones, Mary and Jesus' eyes meet. She looks deep into the eyes of the boy she gave birth to. He looks deep into the eyes of the woman who bore him. They both know what is to come. They both know what will happen. But here, in a moment of tenderness, Jesus is nothing more than her son. How hard it must be to see him bruised, blooded, humiliated, and in the final moments of his life. We will meet her again in our story, but for now, she steps back into the crowd. The fifth station. Simon of Cyrene helps Jesus carry his cross. Simon of Cyrene, a bit part player in the gospel story, standing in the crowd, watching Jesus go past, grabbed by the guards and made to help Jesus carry the cross. Did he know that day that he was going to become a central part of the story? Probably not. Did he hesitate? Did he wonder whether he wanted to be associated with Christ? We don't know. All we know is that he does step forward and take the weight of the cross, supporting Jesus, supporting the instrument of death, but above all helping. A lot of us don't like the idea of helping. We like to think that we are the main actor in our drama. The idea of supporting someone else in their drama seems a nice idea, but not something you'd want to do all the time. How many times, though, are we reminded that the story we are telling is the story of God, of which we play a very small but yet massively significant part. The bit that our human brains never quite get round to understanding is, what do we do with the information that we are small and tiny and should be insignificant, but yet aren't? Here, Simon of Cyrene steps into the grandest narrative of all. Would we do the same? Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. This sixth station is a difficult one. Some people try and remove it from the Stations of the Cross, as it's not a biblical story. Traditionally, it's always been there. And in these stations, Veronica wiping the face of Jesus is painted in glorious white and blue. There is something so tender about her comforting him by wiping his face. A face bruised and battered and caked with blood. We could argue that there is little point in her wiping his face. The wounds will continue to bleed. The thorns from the crown will continue to dig into his head. But there is something fundamentally and completely human about this action. She offers him dignity. How many times in our modern society do we immediately run in to give people charity, to support them, to give them what they need? Whereas actually what most people need is dignity. Taking and receiving a handout can be necessary, but it can also be humiliating and difficult and hard. How often do we just treat people with humility, with service, and make them feel special, loved? The sixth station is all about providing dignity where there has been none, acknowledging the fundamental and central worth of every person. Veronica is in these stations, and her actions here remind us of a central truth of our faith.
O Lord, hear my
Seventh station. Jesus falls for the second time. The second falling is harder. Jesus' energy is now being sapped. The falling is more complete. His body closer to the ground. The cross now needing to be picked up, put upon his back. Then the journey continued. As the hill starts to become steeper, how much harder does it become to keep going? Jesus struggling now to pick up the cross and continue. Sometimes we are faced with things that are incredibly difficult, are hard. On the occasions when we have pushed through, we have sometimes been proud of ourselves, looked back upon our achievements. Here, there is no achievement. In one sense, there is no honour to be found. But yet, in the cross and the crucifixion, Jesus will find glory. Can we find glory in this falling? Can we find honour in this endeavour? The eighth station. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. It's noticeable in this story that apart from Simon of Cyrene, the male disciples have all gone. Veronica reaches out to touch him, but here are the women of Jerusalem. Like many other people in the Bible, they sometimes feel like they're bystanders, people who don't matter. But here, they know who Jesus is. They see him. They hear him. They have come to be with him. They show a bravery severely lacking in the other disciples. So why are they here? Why do they reach out to Christ? Partly, we could argue this is tradition. Women wailing at someone's funeral. But wailing at an execution. And are they wailing or weeping? Are they filled with sorrow? Did they, sometimes alone, recognise who Christ was? We have a tendency to believe that the people who will reach out, the people who will show they care, will be the obvious people. But actually, in our churches and in our communities, sometimes hope, compassion and love come from the most unlikely places. Who are the people who are pushed to the outside, who actually are the ones who see Christ, who hear Christ? They are the ones who this station remembers. The sun beginning to beat down. Why not just lay in the dust? Why not just let them pick you up and carry you up to the cross? But Jesus rises one more time, picks himself up, pulls up the wood of the cross, and begins a slow journey onwards. Is this now a last vestige of pride, an opportunity to show that he is still in control of his destiny? Or is this just what needs to be done? A recognition that the journey is sometimes just putting one foot in front of the other. Christ walks on, and so do we. The 10th station, Jesus is stripped of his clothes. They cast lots. They take his clothes, all designed to humiliate, but also to hurt. This final humiliation, this sense of being now just a plaything for some soldiers. That he is no longer a person, he is an object. His final possessions of hardly anything. Now betted on and distributed. They stripped the prisoners before putting them onto the cross, so that their skin would burn in the sun. They're crucified at midday, so that they would get the full force of the heat of the sun burning down upon exposed skin. Crucifixion was part art and part science, carefully designed to pull people in multiple directions at once. But part of the theatre, part of the spectacle, was the humiliation of being stripped. This final sense of personality, of covering, and of privacy is removed. How do we feel when we think that people know too much about us? We hide, we retreat, we put up barriers. Here, Christ has no barriers. The whole world can see everything. But yet the soldiers didn't. They didn't know who he was. How often do we make the same mistakes? The 11th station. Jesus is nailed to the cross. The nails were carefully put not into the hands and into the feet, but in the gap between the bones in the wrist and across the ankles, with the ankles put one on top of the other. The nails were carefully designed to hold the weight of a human body, but also to cause a maximum amount of pain. They were large enough to stop significant blood loss, and thereby keep the prisoner, the condemned man, alive for as long as possible. The wrists were nailed to the cross slightly higher than the shoulders, and so begins the essential drama of crucifixion. The weight of the body hanging now down from the cross. Means that the condemned person is struggling to breathe. So they then try and lift themselves so that they can catch a breath. Lifting themselves involves putting pressure onto the nails pushed through the wrists. The agonising pain means they can only hold that for a few seconds before they sink back down and start to gasp for breath. This process continues until the body is too weak to continue, where, gasping for air, the condemned person succumbs. All of this whilst the heat of the day burning into the skin, the taunts and jeers of all of those around you. Crucifixion was designed to send a message of horror, a message of pain. What message does it send us now? The 12th station. Jesus dies on the cross. Finally, after 3 hours, Jesus breathes his last. His words from the cross, carefully collected, remembered, spoken through the centuries. Father, forgive them. Into your hands I commend my spirit. It is done. The cross here is completion. A wounded, haunted man gives up his life as the clock strikes 3. The 3 hours in which we wait with Christ are hard, cold, agonizing. Yet nothing to what he went through for us. What did they think he meant? It is done. We know, because we know the end of the story. But for those following Jesus, for those waiting, for those who run away, this looked like defeat. This looked like the end. The 13th station. Jesus is taken down from the cross. The crosses at Golgotha now lay empty. Jesus, traditionally, taken down from the cross. His mother, Mary, present, before his body is taken, wrapped up, and led away. But this final act of generosity, a criminal taken down from the cross, the nails carefully removed, his body washed, wrapped into his burial shroud, the tenderness in which we treat our dead. It is in fact the final act of personhood, where we speak to them as if they were still with us, his body still warm from the sun and from his life, which has ebbed and now gone. We wonder whether he was peaceful. Did he die in pain, or with the sense of accomplishment? We are led inexorably to the final moment. The 14th station. Jesus is laid in the tomb. They took his body, wrapped in the burial shroud, and laid it in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. Placed his body on the cold stone slab, and then rolled the stone across the door. The light slowly, inch by inch, being extinguished, until all that was left inside was the silence and the dark. What did those disciples then do? Did they wait in silence? They walk away together or alone? In this moment, they must have felt completely and utterly lost. When we find ourselves this Good Friday waiting, anxious, afraid, we are feeling the same things that those who loved Christ felt and have always felt. Our journey suddenly stops. We are brought to an abrupt end. On this Good Friday, may we find silence. May we find the death of Christ to be the single most important act in humankind. May we also remember that we must now just wait. Wait for the resurrection. Wait for the glory to be revealed. But now we must wait in sorrow, in trepidation, and in silence.